Richness was the reason Lisa wed me because I was speechless. I could feel her disapproval. I was unconcerned about her feelings for me. It didn't matter if she was mine or not. I vowed to curse not just her, but also her first love and her family. But what I didn't realize was that she could read minds. She audibly picked up on every slur I spat at her in my thoughts. Chapter 1. I was born with no vocal cords. My parents were always concerned about my marriage plans. Fortunately, the Wong family had riches and connections, so finding a partner was never an issue for me. I desired a gentle and pious wife, so my elders arranged for me to marry Lisa, the eldest daughter of the Liu family. However, I learned afterwards that Lisa had an old flame from her youth. She was compelled to marry me after her parents separated them. When I recognized something was off about Lisa on our wedding day, I was quietly cursing her ex-boyfriend in my brain. In front of her, I didn't realize when she first had the ability to read minds. On our wedding day, I stood behind Lisa with a severe attitude. Luckily, she wasn't in the mood to grin either, so the two of us, both stone-faced, accepted the congratulations of the guests. That was until Nathan showed up for the first time that day. Lisa's dead visage melted into a tiny grin. I thought to myself, disgusting. He's dressed like a groom. If someone didn't know better, they'd think he was the one getting married today. I continued hating Nathan in my brain. Lisa abruptly turned to gaze at me, a tinge of alarm in her eyes. I had no idea what was going on and gave her a questioning look. Her warning look passed over me again, this time conveying a trace of annoyance as she whispered, "Watch your words." Ridiculous. I was mute. What words had I ever spoken? I started cursing Nathan in my brain, and while I was at it, I cursed Lisa too. On the surface, though, I stayed calm and controlled, using sign language to inquire, What's going on?" Lisa's countenance darkened. She enunciated each word carefully. "James, do you have a problem with us?" What the hell? How was she reading my thinking like some kind of parasite dwelling in my head? But on the surface, I kept my expression neutral and offered her a naive smile. Lisa sneered harshly and went back to continue chatting to Nathan. The way they were behaved, anyone would believe this was their wedding instead of ours. I kept up my nice grin, but internally, I was swearing. Lisa groaned with annoyance. Chapter 2. As the event drew to a conclusion, Nathan's reluctance to split with Lisa was virtually written all over his face. Lisa's parents had also gone to the gate to see off the visitors. Seeing the two of them lingering together, not only did they say nothing, but Lisa's mother, Sarah, even grinned as she took my elbow and led me away. She replied, "James, they haven't seen each other in a long time. Let them catch up. We'll wait for them in the car." I smiled and nodded, but in my thoughts, I thought, like mother, like daughter, a shameless daughter must come from a shameless mother. Lisa paused in her steps. I observed her expression deepen, but I just believed she was irritated that I was walking too slowly. Never in a million years would I have considered that she could read minds. As I waved at her, I casually tossed in another slur at her father. A rotten daughter must have a rotten father too. Lisa was shocked. I waited in the car with her mother for nearly half an hour. Finally, Lisa and her father went over at a leisurely pace. She turned to her mother and said, "James and I will head back to our place." Her mother was briefly surprised, ready to question something, when her father threw her a look that stopped her. Catching it, her mother smiled significantly and said, all right, you to go home and have a good night." As soon as I stepped out of the automobile, their vehicle raced off. Lisa kept standing there, having no intention of returning home. I glanced at her bewildered. She replied, "So it's not just Nathan you have a problem with, you have issues with my parents too." I was shocked. How was it that everyone I cursed in my brain she somehow knew about? I gazed at her in even more perplexity. But Lisa didn't tell me about her mind-reading abilities. She merely issued me a stern warning: don't make things difficult for Nathan. He was already heartbroken enough when we broke up. Oh, how heartbroken was he? Maybe around 2 minutes of looking aimlessly into nothingness. Then he dramatically declared to Lisa, "Even if you marry someone else, I will wait for you forever." Nathan even had the audacity to attend our wedding and post on Twitter, "Wearing a suit to your wedding, does that count as being your groom?" Even for a moment, that post was now pinned at the top of his social media. His huge demonstration of affection for Lisa was also his harshest insult to me. Just that alone should warrant my making his life miserable, right? And yet Lisa had the guts to warn me for his sake. I scoffed inside and brazenly aired my thoughts. If you love each other so much, why don't you have the guts to ask me for a divorce? If it weren't for my mother's peace of mind, I wouldn't have married you in the first place. And you, with your dumbass attitude, have the nerve to look down on me just because I'm mute. Yeah, you can talk, but I haven't heard you say a single decent word yet, James. Lisa finally snapped, gritting her teeth as she called my name. I was so engaged in my imaginary diatribe that her scream astonished me. I stared at her, asking with my eyes, "What?" Lisa scowled at me and asked, "Did you just call me a dumbass?" I was shocked, sure, everything I claimed was accurate. But, getting caught red-handed like this, yeah, this was beyond embarrassing. Chapter 3. I signed to Lisa. "How do you know I was insulting you?" Lisa didn't want to divulge her mind-reading abilities. She merely rolled her eyes and replied, "Your face says it all." So, according to her, I could curse someone out just with my expression. Doubtful. I stroked my face, reluctant to believe. My expression management had suddenly gotten this horrible. Then, putting on a real grin, I signed, "I didn't call you dumb." Lisa shut her eyes for a second, looking as if she had just experienced internal injuries from pure exasperation. I feigned not to see and turned away, moving for the car on my own, but my mood seemed as vast and dark as a night stretching on with no glimmer of light. I had always known that Lisa married me for money. She resented the fact that I was mute. Fortunately, I didn't like her either. For almost a year, I had endured her presence. But it was all an act, yet today, the doctor informed me my mother didn't have much time left, 3 months at most, for this final stretch. I didn't want her to worry about anything, even if I disliked Lisa, even if I never intended to marry her in the first place. I could tolerate it for my mother's sake. But fate had never been kind to me. I was diagnosed with a terminal condition. The doctor who had been treating my mother was much more heartbroken than I was. He remarked, "James, you're so young. How could this happen?" How? I was heartbroken too. But weirdly, behind the melancholy, there was a glimmer of relief. If I died, I might be with my mother again. That didn't seem so horrible. That night, I stayed at the hospital. It was late when I received a call from an unknown number. It was one of Lisa's close pals. She said, "Brother-in-law, Lisa's drunk. Can you come pick her up?" Someone next her quickly whispered, "Are you stupid? Your brother-in-law is mute. He can't talk. How's he supposed to respond to you?" "Oh yes," her voice took on an ashamed tone. Then she added, "Brother-in-law, my bad. If you can come, just send a text, okay?" I hadn't intended on answering. But maybe because I was dying, the ideas I had long suppressed came up all at once. Divorce. I wanted to divorce Lisa as soon as possible. But now there was a statutory 1-month cooling-off period. Before the divorce could be completed, a month wasn't a long time. But for me, it was too precious. I intended to break all links with Lisa before I died. So, I went to pick her up. She was absolutely spent, resting dutifully on the sofa. I sat alongside her in quiet, waiting for her to sober up. As soon as she did, I would seek for a divorce. Chapter 4. She rested on the sofa for a bit, then sat up with a pout, appearing uncomfortable. I gazed at her unflinching. Maybe my look was too chilly because as our eyes met, Lisa froze. It seemed as if the booze in her system cleaned up a little. "What are you staring at?" she questioned angrily. I signed to her, "Let's get a divorce." Lisa didn't comprehend. After living together for almost a year, she still knew very little about me. Any somewhat sophisticated or rare sign language she couldn't recognize, because she had never even bothered to learn. I let out a secret bitter chuckle in my head. Talking to an idiot is tiresome. Lisa lifted a brow. I grabbed up my phone and wrote out a phrase for her to read. Still fuzzy from the drink, she looked at the words briefly. Disoriented, then she questioned, "Divorce? Who's divorcing who?" I pointed to her, then at myself. Finally, she understood. But she couldn't believe it, a silent man daring to ask her for a divorce. Annoyed, she snorted. "You don't seriously think that after divorcing me, you'll have a bunch of women lining up for you, do you?" I shook my head. My determination didn't waver. She became increasingly enraged. "Fine, if you want a divorce, I'll agree. But everything we discussed before stays the same, your family's investment non-refundable." I nodded. Consider that the price I paid for my mother's pleasure over the past year. It was a substantial payment. But a deal was a deal. There was no taking it back. Lisa looked me warily, even slowing down her words as she questioned, "James, why do you suddenly want a divorce?" That should have been the first thing she asked if she cared about me at all. But because she didn't, she showed her wrath first. Only after that did she bother asking why. I didn't answer. I merely smiled at her as I stood up. She immediately grabbed my wrist and said, "Why are you suddenly insisting on a divorce?" She stood to lose a lot. There has to be a reason. She was undoubtedly used to being cherished, so the notion of getting discarded by a silent man was unbearable. But if she thought about it, she should be glad once we split, she could be with Nathan publicly. Wasn't it a nice thing? I remembered. Back when I proposed to Lisa, I had been prepared to make our marriage work. Even if there was no love, we could still be respectable partners enjoying a solid life together. People just saw our money today, but they didn't realize how my mother And I had nearly been devastated when my father departed. My mother had always worried that I would end up alone after I got married. Mom worried that Lisa and I wouldn't last, so Mom spared no effort in aiding the Liu family and supporting Lisa, all in the hope that I may have a joyful marriage. But our wedding day had already embarrassed me enough. I had previously urged Lisa to talk to Nathan about erasing his pinned post, the one insulting our marriage. But Lisa had answered, "People have the freedom to post whatever they want. Who are you to control him? And what I choose to do or not do is also my freedom. Don't try to control me." It was at that time I realized Lisa wasn't even deserving of mutual respect. After that, I never tried again. But to Lisa, my existence alone constituted a constraint on her freedom. Well, suddenly that restriction was going to evaporate. I thought, "Lisa, I'm dying. You're finally free." As that idea hit, her grasp on my wrist abruptly eased, shock flared over her face. But I didn't realize she could hear my thoughts. I was really pleased she didn't ask any more questions. That spared me the hassle of explaining. After all, she didn't love me. She didn't care about me. Why would my death matter to her? Saying too much will simply make me appear sad. I turned and proceeded toward the bedroom upstairs. With every stride, I couldn't help but moan internally, what a waste of a gorgeous face. If only her character were better, she'd be ideal. Nathan doesn't love her that much, does he? Otherwise, how could he let her bear all the blame? For cheating, they deserve each other, at least after ruining me. They won't go on to damage someone else. But what a shame. I have wandered this planet without ever understanding what love genuinely felt like. Maybe if I had met someone better, I could have experienced it. But Lisa, she wasn't worthy. Chapter 5. After I retired for the night, Lisa headed out to find a partner. This buddy had known her since they were youngsters. The second she spotted Lisa's face, she realized something was awry. At the pub, Lisa seemed worn out, her brow furrowed with stress. Olivia said, "Did you argue with James?" Lisa shot her a sidelong glance, angry that she was both accurate and incorrect simultaneously. Divorce was significantly more serious than a casual dispute. Plus, there was James's health concern. It seemed grave. Frowning, Lisa held the cup before her and took a sip. But instead of the usual sting of booze, she tasted tea. She sighed. That's when she recalled she and Olivia were sipping tea. It was strange, truly. Olivia worked at a bar but only ever drank tea. Lisa questioned, "By the way, why did you abruptly stop drinking, Olivia?" Olivia answered, "It wasn't abrupt. It's been 2 years." Lisa scowled. "But 2 years ago, it was sudden." Olivia didn't react. Lisa said, "If I recall correctly, you quit drinking because of David, right? Did he really influence you that much?" Olivia threw her a glare. "How can you sip tea and still chat so much?" Lisa sneered and took another sip. For a long period, neither talked. Then, out of the blue, Olivia remarked, "He influenced me a lot. When he vanished, it felt like my life ended too." Lisa scowled. "But when he was around, you didn't seem to care that much." Olivia groaned. "That's why you must cherish people while you can. That goes for you too." Their friend group had an implicit hierarchy. Based on age, Olivia was the oldest, but she seldom lectured anyone, especially about relationships. Maybe since it was late and neither was in a good mood, she was finally opening up. Olivia questioned, "Lisa, how do you truly feel about James and Nathan?" Lisa took a drink of tea and answered, "I don't really feel anything for Nathan anymore. The breakup was just so sudden, and it hit him hard. I felt guilty. So I wanted to make it up to him." Olivia nodded. "And James?" Lisa mumbled, "James." She considered for a long time but couldn't find the correct words. Olivia suggested, "You're just accustomed to him. Maybe you've developed feelings over time." Lisa hesitated. "Maybe a bit." It was only when James unexpectedly sought for a divorce tonight that she realized exactly how dangerous habits may be. In that moment, she envisaged going home to an empty house, and it annoyed her. Olivia said, "Since you've moved on from your ex, don't hurt the person beside you." Lisa rolled her eyes. "Why are you full of wisdom all of a sudden?" Olivia said, "Because I've lost someone." Lisa stayed quiet. Olivia sighed. "Take my advice, treat James well, or you'll regret it." Lisa smirked. "If I regret it, would you finally buy me a drink?" Olivia let out a frigid laugh. "I hope you can stay that obstinate forever." Chapter 6. The next morning when I awakened, Lisa was gone. I sent her a message. "Where did you go?" She didn't reply. A while later, I heard movement outside. I thought she had returned. After all, we had discussed divorce the previous night, and she had more or less agreed. Today we should be going to the Civil Affairs Bureau. But when I opened the door, the person standing outside was Nathan. His attitude toward me had always been unpleasant, and now that Lisa wasn't around, he was even more unrestrained in his mockery. He said, "Let's talk." Then, as if suddenly remembering, he sneered, "Oh right, you're a mute, just like Lisa." He had a voice, he just didn't know how to use it properly. Still, I was curious. What did he want to discuss? And what right did he have to demand a conversation with me? I stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. Nathan raised an eyebrow, surprised, but eventually walked in and sat on the sofa. I turned to grab a pen and paper, ready to communicate that way. But before I could write anything, he scoffed. "A guest arrives and you don't even offer them." "Water, a guest?" What type of guest was he? Good thing I didn't love Lisa otherwise. He'd be my adversary. I grinned and wrote, "Say what you need to say. Don't waste my time." Nathan let out a frigid laugh. "What do you think? Just because you married Lisa, your life will be smooth sailing? You two will get divorced sooner or later." I smiled again and wrote, "It was your Lisa who married me in exchange for temporary peace of mind. If it weren't for my family's investment, the Liu family would have gone bankrupt long ago. Even now, despite their recovery, they wouldn't dare kick me out entirely. If I didn't bring up divorce, Lisa would probably stay with me indefinitely." Who did Nathan think he was? I gave him a cool, uninterested gaze. No need for threats. No need for harsh words. The balance of power was clearly evident after just one look. Nathan was outraged. He leaped up from the sofa, gritting his teeth. "You think money makes you invincible? No matter how rich you are, you're still a mute." I asked Lisa. "She's never even let you touch her in all this time. Even if you don't divorce her, you'll never have children together. Your dad is dead, your mom is dying, and once you're gone, everything you have will." Bang. I punched Nathan straight in the face, knocking him back onto the sofa. He clutched his face, struggling to sit up. I had hit him hard, so hard that my own fingers ached. But he had brought up my parents. He could have Lisa, I didn't care. But if he dared to speak about my family, then he deserved to get hit. Nathan eventually snapped out of his daze and started cursing at me. He probably wanted to fight back. But then we heard footsteps outside. He realized Lisa was back. So? He had to endure it. He had to make me the villain. Lisa didn't disappoint him. The moment she walked in and saw him bleeding from his nose, she turned to me and demanded, "James, what are you doing?" Here we go again. I lost count of how many times the scene had played out. Sometimes I even suspected that in their little affair, I was just a prop, something that made it all feel more exciting. But today, I wasn't playing along. I picked up my phone and locked it, and pressed play on a recording. It was a collection of all the insults, mockery, and taunts Nathan had thrown at me every time we were alone. His voice rang out clear and undeniable, sneering, spitting out vile words one sentence after another. Nathan's face went pale. Lisa was stunned. The recording wasn't even finished when Nathan suddenly lunged, trying to snatch my phone. "Nathan." Lisa's voice was sharp, low, and laced with barely contained anger. Nathan froze, panic flashing in his eyes. He quickly tried to explain, "Lisa, you have to trust me. That's not me." He faked it. He must have utilized AI too. Lisa's expression remained dark. "Get out, Lisa. Get out. Don't make me say it a third time." Nathan clenched his teeth, his face twisted in frustration. But in the end, he had no choice but to stumble out the door. Honestly, if he had managed to squeeze out a few tears just now, his performance would have been perfect. With his acting skills, he might even have a shot at an Oscar. Chapter 7. After Nathan left, Lisa saw my cold expression and, for once, softened her tone. "James, let's talk." She sounded just like Nathan. It was disgusting. I scoffed, picked out the paper and pen, and wrote, "There's nothing to discuss except the divorce." Lisa hesitated, then said, "This morning, I went to the hospital to see your mom. In over a year of marriage, this was the first time she had visited my mother alone, and it was after I asked for a divorce. I felt no surprise, only disgust." I wrote, "I already agreed to all your conditions." "Why did you go see my mom?" Lisa replied. "She doesn't know you're sick, does she?" I froze. How did she know I was sick? I shot up from my seat. My usual composure shattered. Lisa met my gaze and slowly said, "You don't have to write. I can hear what you're thinking." I was speechless. This wasn't just shocking, it shattered my entire understanding of reality. No wonder she always questioned me whenever I cursed her parents, Nathan, or even her. Every word of my silent insults, she had heard them loud and clear. I asked, "Since when?" She answered, "Half a year ago. The night you got back from the hospital. That was the night my mother's illness worsened. The physicians had recommended an alternate procedure, but the prospects of success were minimal. That night, when my mother fell asleep, I sat beside her hospital bed till 2 in the morning. The nurse had already gone home. But in the middle of the night, she unexpectedly returned to the hospital. She took my hand and whispered, "James, I was worried about you." A stranger, someone who was simply doing her job for money, left the warmth of her bed in the middle of the night because she cared about me. Meanwhile, Lisa had been to a party. Nathan was there too. Nathan even boldly blogged about it online. They were rejoicing. And I was in quiet anguish, unable even to cry out loud. I never would have thought that the night Lisa obtained her mind-reading skill was that night. At 4 in the morning, when I eventually arrived home, she had just gotten back as well. I remembered she murmured something when she spotted me. Back then, I was too grief-stricken to pay attention. I believed she was whining about my terrible mood. But suddenly I realized she had been asking if something was wrong. I ignored her. And in that instant, she heard my thoughts for the first time. That night, I had thought, why does my mother have to be sick if someone had to suffer? It should have been Lisa. She deserves it. She should be the one dying. Lisa had been mute. At first, she didn't believe it. But after hearing my thoughts again and again, she slowly understood it was true. And practically every time I was smiling on the outside while hating her on the inside. Out of every 10 thoughts she heard, 8 were insults targeted at her. The final 2 curses against her parents and Nathan. Lisa sighed. I always thought, you were just petty, that you resented my past with Nathan. So you kept bad-mouthing him in your head. I never knew that he insulted you too. Oh, he insulted me lots, and his statements were terrible. But neither of them had expected me to film everything, every single time. I hadn't initially meant to expose him. I had only retained the tapes as leverage, something to use if I ever needed it, but because Nathan had asked for it, I was more than delighted to give him what he deserved. I glanced at Lisa coldly and said in my mind, now that you know everything, so what? Lisa pulled her lips together, hesitating. She didn't want to talk about Nathan. Fine. I wouldn't force her. So, I offered a new question. When are we going to the Civil Affairs Bureau? Lisa answered. James, you should focus on your treatment right now. I wrote, what I do or don't do is none of your business. Those were her identical comments to me earlier. Now I was tossing them back at her. Without waiting for her reply, I stood up and departed. Lisa yelled after me, James, where are you going? What's it to you, dumbass? Lisa was speechless. Chapter 8. I went to the hospital. The caregiver greeted me with a grin. Missile, you came by this morning. I nodded. Seeing that I wasn't surprised, she hesitated before asking gently, are you two back together? I shook my head, then took out my phone and texted, we're getting a divorce. She was stunned. Holding my hand tightly, she questioned, did she ask for it? I replied, no. I did. I was the one who didn't want Lisa. So what if she was stunningly beautiful? She had never loved me, never even seen me as her spouse. What was the point of preserving such a marriage? The caregiver scrutinized my countenance. Reading the confidence in my eyes, she exhaled, eyes reddening. Then, what will you do from now on? Yes, what would I do? My father was long gone, my mother was dying, and I was gravely ill. I had all the money in the world, yet I couldn't purchase a single person who actually cared about me. The caregiver seemed much sadder than I felt. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I bowed my head, avoiding her stare, because if I saw her gaze, I could lose control and cry too. But even if I did, no sound would come out. Silent agony was like a boomerang flowing out with my tears only to circle back and cut into my heart all over again. I know the sensation too well. It stung so much that I hoped I could simply die and be done with it. The caretaker told me that Lisa had spent a long time chatting to my mother that morning. After Lisa departed, my mother surreptitiously wiped away tears. The caregiver hadn't dared to question too much, scared of making her even unhappy. But I could guess what Lisa had said. I wrote out a message to my mother. What did Lisa say to you this morning? She grinned warmly. What else? She said that your relationship is getting better, and that I should wait to become a grandmother. I signed, no. She wouldn't say that. Why not? My mother jokingly rolled her eyes. Didn't you always tell me how good she was to you? That had all been falsehoods. To make my lies more credible, I had even taken photographs of my takeaway dinners and forwarded them to my mother, claiming Lisa had prepared them. I had weaved so many falsehoods that in my mother's eyes, Lisa and I had always been a happy pair. But now, I had to be the one to break that fantasy. I signed, Mom. Lisa and I are getting a divorce. She wasn't astonished. Simply somewhat astonished before she softly inquired, is Lisa just throwing a tantrum? I shook my head and replied, she doesn't love me. My mother sighed. I see. She stretched out and drew me into a hug. In that instant, all the serenity she had been holding onto broke. Her voice shook. Our James is such a wonderful person. If she doesn't love you, it's her loss. You must have suffered so much holding on this long for my sake. I shook my head. I didn't feel like I had suffered, even though Lisa had never fully broken connections with Nathan. I had never loved her, so I wasn't heartbroken, just amused at the silliness of it all. The only thing that made me sad was that I hadn't asked for a divorce sooner, hadn't informed my mother the truth earlier, because in the end, she had to hear it from Lisa's lips that she didn't love me. When Lisa had uttered those words this morning, my mother must have been crushed. Hearing her own kid being so totally rejected, she gulped back tears and attempted to soothe me. It's okay, James, you're such a good person. You'll definitely meet someone even better in the future. Just let Lisa live to regret this. I smiled and nodded. But deep inside I knew Lisa wouldn't regret it and I wouldn't have a future. Chapter 9. Lisa continued postponing the divorce. I had called her many times, but she either made excuses or ignored me entirely. Losing patience, I presented the problem straight to her parents and then they detonated. Richard scolded her harshly. We overlooked your situation with Nathan. But how can you have no boundaries at all? If James makes us public he's mute and from a single-parent family, the public will side with him. It'll ruin your reputation and drag down the Ucorp stock price. Go apologize to James immediately. No matter what, you cannot get divorced. After scolding Lisa, they turned to me, trying to play the sympathy card. They brought expensive gifts to the hospital, telling my mother how much they cherished me. Sarah answered kindly. Whatever Lisa has done wrong, we'll discipline her, we'll make sure she changes for the better. James, don't act on impulse. Talking about divorce so casually, it's the worst thing for a marriage. There's no such thing between me and Lisa, just as I was thinking that. Lisa entered the room and heard my thoughts word for word. Her brows furrowed. I put on an innocent face and just for fun, added another thought, big dumb bozo. After all, no one else could hear me criticize her in her parents' perspective. I was still the victim. Lisa had no way to justify herself. Frustrated, she took me outside. She answered, I'll agree to anything except divorce, I said. So if I keep mistresses, you'd be fine with that too, George, I added. Just divorce me already, at least let me have some peace before I die. She paused. Do you really hate me that much? I hadn't expected her to ask that, but her look was serious. She looked me in the eye and said, James, can we try again? Had her parents drove her insane? What was there to try again? We had never started in the first place. I stared at her and intentionally considered one word at a time. Lisa, I have never liked you. Not even in the beginning. I had only ever wanted a stable life. That had nothing to do with love. I continued. Let's stop this while we can still be nice. Sign the divorce papers or I'll take this to court if things became nasty. It wouldn't just be my reputation on the line. Lisa bit her lip, glaring at me. James, you're cruel, flattered, just as she was about to explode. The caretaker came running toward me, her face full of panic. James, I turned to her, and my heart sank. A terrible premonition rippled through me. She grabbed my arm, breathless. Your mother, she's begging for you. It's not looking good. A deafening silence filled my ears, as if thunder had struck inside my head. If the caretaker hadn't been holding on to me, I might have collapsed on the spot. She hurried me back to the room. Doctors and nurses surrounded my mother's bed. Even Lisa's parents looked anxious. Sarah tried to reassure me. Don't worry. James will locate the greatest physicians. Your mother will be fine. No, she wouldn't. We had money, enough to buy the best medicine, hire the best doctors, but not enough to stop death. After a round of tests, the doctor turned to us and shook his head. In that moment, I swear I heard my own heart crack. The medical staff stepped aside and my mother reached out her hand mechanically. I moved forward and held it, my own hands trembling. James, her voice was barely a whisper. Faint and fragile, Mommy has to go now. Don't cry. I wanted to listen to her. I wanted to be strong for her, but my tears wouldn't stop falling. She tried to lift her other hand to wipe them away, but she was so weak. Her hand barely moved before it dropped back down. James, don't cry. I nodded desperately, my mouth opening, trying to form words. I had once been able to speak. As a child, I had called out Mom and Dad. If I could just say Mom now, maybe I could have one less regret. But no sound came out. No matter how wide I opened my mouth, nothing left my lips, until Lisa leaned down and whispered, James wants to call you Mom. My mother's cloudy eyes suddenly shone with light. She smiled at me and nodded. Mommy heard it. Then she looked around at the others, silently telling them to leave. Only Lisa and I remained. I thought she was going to ask us to stay together, but instead she took Lisa's hand and begged her, will you please divorce James? Lisa froze, eyes shifting toward me. Suddenly, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I clutched my chest. Something inside me had completely shattered. Before, my mother had worried about leaving me alone, hoping someone would stay by my side. But now she was afraid my marriage would ruin me, afraid I would spend my life trapped in a mistake. She wanted Lisa to set me free. Please, she whispered, agree to the divorce. I didn't know if Lisa was moved by a dying person's last wish or if she finally had a conscience. But in the end, she agreed. My mother let out a sigh of relief. She touched my head and smiled. "James, just be yourself. Be cheerful." "I will," she said. "Mommy's going to locate Daddy immediately. Come later, okay? In the next life, be our kid again, okay, James?" In her final moment, I lifted her into my arms. She took her last breath there, in my embrace. I held her hand and felt her life slip away. I thought, "Mom, I'm sorry, but I'm about to disobey you one last time. I'm coming to find you and Dad shortly." Chapter 10. When I came up, I was in a hospital room. Lisa was sitting by the bed. I had no clue how much time had passed. Seeing me start to get up, she immediately exclaimed, "I've already planned for your mother's burial. Don't hurry. Get out." The sharp, unhesitating words left Lisa momentarily stunned. Holding back her temper, she said, "James, I already told your mother I would divorce you. Can you at least quit hating me so much?" "I can't, unless you die." Lisa was speechless. Realizing that talking to me was useless, she got up and went outside to cool off. When she returned, she found me typing furiously on my phone. Something about the way I looked set off alarm bells in her head. She rushed forward and snatched the phone from my hands. Her eyes widened as she read what I had written. "James, do you have to do this?" she snapped. I replied, "I previously told you if you refuse to divorce me, I don't mind making this public." I was prepared to post a divorce declaration. I didn't care if it wrecked the Liu family's reputation. I didn't care if Liu Corp's stock price dropped. I was dying. Why should I worry about anyone else's survival? Lisa gazed at me for a long time, seeing that I had no intention of backing down. Her countenance eventually shifted, subtle but loaded with tiredness. Softly, she whispered, "James, I already promised your mother I would divorce you. Don't bring up my mother. If you hadn't gone to the hospital and told her you didn't love me, she wouldn't have been so upset. She could have lived a bit longer." Lisa stiffened. Then, after a pause, she said, "I never said that. I went to the hospital to find out about your condition. I figured since I was already there, I should check on your mother. But I never said anything like that." Maybe my mother had been too perceptive. Picking up the truth from Lisa's demeanor alone, Lisa hesitated, then continued, "I should have told you first. I'm sorry, James." "Yeah, if she had told me, at least I could have prepared. We could have kept the tale straight. My mother wouldn't have been able to pull the truth out of her." I was filled with animosity, but as I thought about it further, I realized I had no one to blame except myself. If I had acknowledged I didn't love Lisa sooner, if I hadn't swallowed my fury on our wedding day. Too many ifs. I was exhausted, very tired. The Liu family wanted to organize an expensive burial for my mother, but in line with her preferences, I kept everything basic. After she was buried, I moved back to my own residence. Tabloid reporters followed Lisa, taking many photographs of her standing outside my building but never entering. Speculation arose. People believed that our two families had fallen out, and that we were going for a divorce. The rumors drove Liu Corp stock prices plunging. Lisa's parents came to visit me, hoping I might reconcile with their daughter. Richard continued, "James, think about us too. If we're being honest, Lisa never really did anything wrong to you. If our company collapses, how does that benefit you, Mom?" Lisa immediately ran in. Cutting short her mother's comments, she turned to her parents and said, "Go home." They were visibly angry, their features tight with displeasure. Lisa glanced at me. I hadn't moved at all. More significantly, I hadn't thought anything. She instantly looked uneasy. She came forward and said, "James, let's go for a walk, okay?" Since moving back, I hadn't left the house for almost 2 weeks. This big mansion was deserted except for me. I didn't speak, and no one talked to me. I let myself fall further and deeper into this soundless world, further and farther down. Chapter 11. Lisa disregarded her folks and brought me outside. Once we got into the car, she asked, "Is there anywhere you'd like to go?" I glanced out at the sunlight, so bright, so warm. The blood in my veins, which had been lifeless for so long, suddenly began to move again. I thought, "I want to go to the mall." Lisa nodded. She didn't understand why I suddenly wanted to go shopping, but she didn't question it. Not until I got a well-fitted suit. That was when she started to realize I wanted to wear it when I went to see my folks. By the time we got at the cemetery, the sun was sinking. The golden brightness of the sunset showered the gravestones in soft light, standing at their tomb. I adjusted my collar and smiled. I thought, "Mom, Dad, do you remember what I'm wearing today? Doesn't it look just like the suit I wore on my birthday as a child? The one you both picked out for me? I dressed like this so you would recognize me right away. Living alone is tiring. I miss you both very much." Lisa stood behind me, listening to every syllable in my heart. I didn't care whether she heard at this time. Nothing mattered anymore. But Lisa did care. She quickly went forward and put her arms around me from behind. Her voice seemed scratchy, like she was straining to hold something back. James, the hospital found a matching donor. If you undergo the transplant, you'll be able to live. I don't need it. She tightened her grasp on me. But didn't you say you don't want to have anything to do with me after you die? I scheduled the surgery for a month from now. We can go to the Civil Affairs Bureau first, finalize a divorce, and then you can have the operation. It was a tempting offer. If my mother were still living, I would have consented without hesitation. But suddenly, I had no reason to keep going. The agony in my body was nothing. The sorrow in my heart, however, was enough to engulf everything. I thought, Lisa, I'm tired. She murmured, then please, I'm begging you, just take the surgery, okay? I still shook my head. A tear landed on my sleeve. Then another. Lisa's choked voice trembled behind me. Your parents, they would want you to live. Do it for them, not for me. Please, we can obtain the divorce first. Then you may get the procedure, James. I sighed gently, then thought, okay. Chapter 12. On the day we got our divorce certificates, Lisa seemed to be in a great mood. She wore makeup and a brand new dress. Looking down at the little red booklet in her hands, she then lifted her head and said to me, "Let me take you to the hospital." I shook my head. But she insisted. She said, "We agreed you go straight to surgery after getting the divorce. If I don't visit you in the hospital myself, what if you run away halfway?" I didn't argue. But for some reason, I felt a strange unease all day. Lisa acted relaxed, even cheerful. Yet something about her felt unbearably heavy. She followed me all the way to the operating room doors. Just before I went in, she leaned down and whispered, "James, don't be frightened. Everything will get better." I wasn't afraid at all. If anything, she looked like the one who was scared. Maybe that late-night conversation with Olivia had woken her up. Maybe over time she had really developed feelings for me. But it was too late. Everything was too late. The surgery was a success. Before I was discharged, New Corp's lawyer came to see me with some documents to sign. It was a compensation agreement, something Lisa had voluntarily set up after our divorce. The sum equated to nearly half of the money my family had invested in their company. The lawyer said that this was the most Lisa had been able to fight for on my behalf. She didn't show up that day, and for a long time after, she didn't appear before me again. Nor did she appear in public. Her parents also became much more low profile. Even when the media asked about her directly, they avoided the topic. I converted all my assets into a bank account balance. Then I left that day. The weather was awful. It rained nonstop. I stood by the airport's glass window, watching the raindrops slide down its surface. Then, in the reflection, I thought I saw a familiar figure. But when I turned around, all I saw was a sea of strangers. People hurrying toward better futures. No time to look back. 2 years later, on Lunar New Year's Eve, after a long silence, Lisa finally posted on social media, "Happy New Year." The photo attached was of an airport, but aside from the glass panels, there was no one in the frame, no indication of who she was speaking to. And yet everyone seemed to know. Many people liked the post. No one left a comment. Lisa had just set her phone down when an unknown number called. The caller ID showed an international number. She hesitated, then picked up. At first, the other end was silent, then a voice came through. "Happy New Year." It wasn't a thought in her mind, it was a real voice. A warm, deep voice like heaven's melody. Lisa didn't respond. The call disconnected a moment later. But that day it became the happiest New Year of Lisa's life. She whispered, "Happy New Year, James. I hope you're pleased too."